Russians vote, but it's a foregone conclusion, a landslide for Vladimir Putin's party. What will it mean for the strongman's grip on power, and what will he do next? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. They're set for a landslide result. With polling at a close in the world's biggest country, Vladimir Putin's party seems certain of massive victory. Russians have been voting in their tens of millions across 11 time zones. And though 11 parties took part, opinion polls suggest the United Russia Party will take nearly 2/3 of the seats. Opposition parties have accused the government of undermining their campaigns, while independent monitors say their efforts to observe the elections have been hampered, claims the Russian authorities deny. Well, victory for United Russia will bolster Mr. Putin's hold on power. He's forced to step down as president next year after 2 terms in office, but he's already suggested he could seek to retain his grip on the Kremlin by becoming prime minister. Putin's hugely popular at home for their economic policies which have boosted living standards, but critics accuse him of edging the country towards dictatorship and say that he's manipulated the elections to prevent any real challenge. Well, joining our discussion today are our guests in Moscow, Alexander Pikayov, a political analyst from the Institute for World Economy and International Relations. He's also served as advisor in the Defense Committee at the Duma. In London, Alexander Nekrasov, author and a former advisor to the late Russian President Boris Yeltsin. And in Washington, D.C., Nicholas Gvozdev, editor of The National Interest and a senior fellow of strategic studies at the Nixon Center. Mr. Gvozdev, was this an election or rather an exercise in confirming that power does indeed lie with Putin?
It wasn't a free and fair election, certainly by Western standards. It was more like the old referenda that Napoleon used to hold, where the course of the country is more or less settled, but the people get a chance to indicate their support for the course that has been predetermined. And as it turns out, it does seem that voter turnout was reasonably high, and that most people were prepared to engage in this act of ratification of the course that Putin is taking the country.
Yeah, we've just heard that the Electoral Commission has said that more than 60% of Russians have turned out to vote. Do you think, Mr. Nekrasov, that this is a dry run for the March 2008 elections?
Well, basically, I personally think that this election was suddenly turned into a referendum. I think basically it was a parliamentary election, and the moment Mr. Putin stepped into the shoes of the leader of the United Russia Party, suddenly everything changed around and it was called a referendum. I personally think that politically Putin has damaged himself, because when he was saying that he's no longer going to stay for the 3rd term, that was one thing. But now we see a desperate man trying to find a way of keeping the reins of power in his hands. I think that will damage him in the long run.
Mr. Pikayov, do you agree with that?
Well, basically it was a surprise here, because United Russia would anyway receive a strong majority of votes, and Mr. Putin increased its popularity even further, so that now we might have a 2-party parliament which would be represented by the Putin's United Russia and the Communist Party. It's in idea, there is nothing wrong here, because there are 2-party structure in the US Congress as well. But some people really are not very glad that many other parties would not pass 7% barrier, which is considered as too high. And even pro-Putin official opposition party, Just Russia, would experience problems to pass. Likely would experience problems in passing the 7% barrier. So it might be quite strange new parliament. That's true.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that. Now, President Putin has been accused of trying to influence the election outcome. Changes to the electoral law mean that political parties need over 7% of the vote to win a place in the Russian parliament. now up from 5%. President Putin has defended the changes on the grounds that they strengthen major parties and weaken regional and separatist interests. Yet critics have lashed out. They accuse Putin of trying to stymie opposition and say the new law seeks to strengthen the United Russia Party. I mean, Mr. Gvozdev, it certainly seems that there's no room at the Duma for opposition parties.
Well, there's no room for small parties that in the past were always able to get some representation. Also because there's a big change that's occurred is the elimination of single mandate districts. So before, even if a party could not get representation, popular candidates could still be elected to represent specific seats. Now the Duma is completely based upon party list representation, which means that independent members of the Duma from the last Duma will not be able to run unless their party ends up crossing the 7% threshold. Really, though, I mean, 5%, 7%, I think that people are less concerned about threshold numbers and we're more concerned about an environment where it appears that while it's true that a majority of Russians are going to support United Russia, that you don't really have much effort made to ensure that a wide range of different voices would be represented in the Duma. The fact that the communists will clear the threshold means that you have essentially an unreconstructed old-style communist party versus the party of Putin's administration. You don't have other parties there, and so I think that raises concerns that you don't have a completely representative scope. These, by the way, are questions that are being raised not only for Russia. We're seeing them raised with Venezuela, with the way Turkey's elections were carried out, with Georgia's elections. So some of this is also not specific simply to Russia, but is part of a larger question where you have strong presidential systems emerging around the world that don't always seem to leave a lot of room for a vibrant political opposition.
Mr. Pikayev, do you think that we'll be seeing more clamping down of opposition as Putin seals his hold on power, certainly through his party, if anything else?
Well, actually, the thing is that that in fact the results of these elections, they reflect a real situation in Russia. When vast majority of population supports President Putin, people are tired from anarchy of 1990s, which they wrongly, maybe wrongly associate with democracy, and they really like stability, which was brought during Mr. Putin rule, and they certainly like a dramatic increase in living standards. At least it is visible in Russian big cities, even outside Moscow. This is a new phenomena for many years. Also, Russia experiences economic growth unprecedented since 1960s. Therefore, the problem is not with the strength of Mr. Putin, but the problem is with the popular support for Mr. Putin, which undermines strength of the opposition. Opposition is weak because people tend to support Mr. Putin and whatever Mr. Putin would ask from them.
Okay, Mr. Nekrasov, there is no alternative to Mr. Putin at the moment. Him and his party have certainly made sure of that. So what options are there for him retaining power, him being the strong man?
Oh, there are many options for him. Basically, he's waiting now to see how many votes and how many seats he has in parliament. And then if he has the so-called constitutional majority, he can do whatever he wants. He can become prime minister, he can become
and excuse me, it certainly seems likely at this stage it will get two-thirds majority, his party.
Well, basically, he can do what he wants. He can become prime minister, with more powers than the president. He can become national leader. He can actually ask the parliament to change the constitution and stay on as president. So, no, we're looking at different options here. What I don't agree with is that President Putin does not enjoy that huge popularity in Russia. Because, first of all, the economy is not doing well. The so-called growth is basically the oil and gas money. It has nothing to do with manufacturing. The industry is basically at 0 point, and the economy is not developing in a proper way. And the standards of living are not high. Unfortunately, I will not agree with the previous speaker. If you go out of Moscow about 100 kilometers, you would see poverty. You
but
would
he has
see those
brought a middle
villages which
class
are
to Russia for the first time.
Well, middle class in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and maybe some other cities. But if you look across the board, you would see that pensioners are getting tiny, tiny pensions, that the salaries of workers are tiny and low. So this talk about, the miracle of Russia, it comes from the fact that those oligarchs and, big businessmen buying, huge villas in Paris, I mean, in France, in Britain, and so on, and people somehow connected to the economy in Russia. There's absolutely no connection at all. And as regards the popularity of Putin, which is allegedly at 70%, I doubt it very much. I would put it at 45% in real terms. Because if you take the whole country, and not just Moscow and St. Petersburg, you'd probably get that sort of figure.
Mr. Gvozdev, it seems likely, I mean, taking all that in mind, and certainly what we're hearing about the election turnout and the polls, it certainly seems likely that he's going to win, but that these polls were not free and fair. Do you think he should be punished? There's some suggestions that he should be removed from the G8.
Well, I think it's going to be difficult to remove a country that has the world's third largest currency reserves from the G8 at a time when the dollar is becoming very soft and energy security is at the top of the agenda. So I think that removing from the G8, we heard these calls last year and the year before, and they didn't come to anything because there are some sound economic reasons now for Russia to be in the G8 that makes it a little bit more difficult for the group to remove him, despite the question of democracy. And if you have President Sarkozy in Beijing saying that the group should be expanded to include China, whose democratic credentials are non-existent, then it really makes it hard to explain why Russia should leave and China should come in. With regard to punishment, I mean, I think it's a situation we're not in 1994. The West does not really have very many points of influence over Russia. We can disagree about the extent to which the economy is trickling down to a middle class and a lower class, but Russia certainly doesn't have debt to the West. It is not dependent as much as it was in the 90s, so that you don't have those economic influences. Russia does not want to be in the European Union, so the ability of Europeans to insist upon compliance with standards that they could ask for Poland or Bulgaria or even Turkey are not in the place of Russia. And the West, and the United States in particular, needs Russia now in certain areas, notably Iran, where I think that really will limit the leverage. So I think what you'll have from the West is a lot of complaining. You'll have a lot of talk about how Russia's not a democracy, how this is a terrible course of affairs, and then you're going to have more or less business as usual between the major Western states and Putin's Russia, just not simply referring to the country as a democracy or really saying that it's part of the Euro-Atlantic community of nations, but otherwise working with Russia the same way that we in the United States have to work with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about just that, how the West is going to deal with Russia under an increasingly defiant Putin. Stay with us.